and everything starts to work. So let me go ahead and jump in. And as I am noting in a rather lame echoing, I want to reflect on the elections that just occurred, and to do so by asking a range of questions. And so one of them has to do with, to what degree should we view 2025 is predicting the near or the medium-term political future. I don't think there's any predicting the long-term political future. But having said that, right, the idea that this is clearly a correction election, right, an election that punishes the incumbent party for being the incumbent party, but also for doing things that, as seems to be the almost iron law of contemporary American politics, which is that the party that wins an election overinterprets the mandate that it got and abuses that mandate, and then the electorate has to punish it. Is it just one of those elections, a so-called thermostatic election, right? When it gets to be too hot in your room, if your thermostat is working, it kicks the air conditioning on, and boy, things look kind of hot in a lot of American cities right now. Did the electorate just vote to cool them down a little bit? Or to put it differently, if America is not just subject to thermostatic elections, but also to more long-term ideological pendulum swings, is this the beginning of the political pendulum swinging in the other direction, moving back in the direction of the kind of politics I think we thought we were headed towards in 2008, 2012, a more multiracial, multicultural, tolerant, liberal, progressive politics, and certainly the fact that a democratic socialist won in New York City might give that impression. So that's one level I want to ask this on. And then a second level has to do with the question of whether or not the Republican Party, right, which I've tried to argue in various things we've talked about together before, one of the major laments I think people like me have about democracy in America in the 21st century is that we don't have a 21st century conservative party. We have a conservative party that looks backward at the first half of the 20th century or the last quarter of the 19th century with nostalgia and wants to go back there, right? And we have a political system that actually lets them eke out power using that regressive view of where America should be. And would it be the case, is it possibly the case that the Republican Party will begin to recognize that although Donald Trump does win elections for himself, he is mainly political poison for their brand. So we'll get into it in just a moment, but 2025 is really a decisive repudiation of Make America Great Again politics. In the post by Nate Silver, the pollster, or I guess I should say, quantitative analyst who used to work for the New York Times and who now has his own analytic apparatus. He said this is 10 out of 10 for the Democrats. They couldn't have done any better, couldn't have asked for anything more than what they got on Tuesday. And so the third and deepest question I want to ask in reflecting on this election is whether we might be getting a little carried away. Right, it might be a good thing for the Democratic Party not to have been knocked out, but to have gotten back up and given Donald Trump a bloody nose. But this is not a knockout punch, right? This is not anything other than a couple governorships and rights, Supreme Court, state Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, Utilities Board in Georgia, and a proposition in California. And as we get into Proposition 50, I am going to ask the question, is it healthy for American democracy to be in a mode where whichever party has the advantage uses that advantage to redistrict, to, if you will, change the rules of the game, not according to the way in which the rules are structured every 10 years in the aftermath of a census in order to preserve the principle of one person, one vote. No, to do it as often as necessary to preserve maximum partisan advantage. Is that healthy for democracy? Is it a reflection of a broken electoral system? If we have a broken electoral system, are we perhaps not able to use the broken electoral system to actually cure what ails American democracy? If so, then maybe 2025 does not predict a lot other than this continual swing back and forth in our politics and growing discontent with the way in which our political system does not allow us to translate our aspirations, our needs, our urgent interests into meaningful policy outcomes. So, before I get into all of that, I have on the board here the cover of the New Yorker magazine, which of course is not out yet. This is from more than a week from now, the next issue, right? And it has Zoran Mamdani, the mayor-elect of New York City, riding the subway. And this is something he does every day. And he takes reporters along with him so that they can interview him, but also so that they can see him interacting with the people in New York City. And if you ride the subway in New York City, this is actually a pretty representative group, right? You've got this wonderfully diverse representation of the city in this little frame, right? Including the Hasidic or ultra-Orthodox Jew, the punk rocker, African American, maybe somebody of a slightly different racial, right? And it's just, it is in each subway car a microcosm of the diversity of the city and the diversity of the country. And Zoran Mamdani is somebody who actually gets out and interacts with and seems to be capable of connecting with the diversity of America, and at least as it's represented in New York City. I'll get more into him in a moment, but well, let me start now. The idea that he's not just right the mayor-elect of New York City. He's the youngest mayor in a century. He is the first Muslim American mayor of any major American city. And he is the first social democratic mayor that I'm aware of any major American city, certainly of a city the size of New York City or one of our largest metropolises. And he won resounding victory, right? It was a narrow victory in terms of percentage, 50.6, but, more than or almost 10% more than the next highest vote getter. But with this tremendous outpouring of New Yorkers voting for him, and especially the most young people ever to vote in an election, people under 34 in Tuesday's election. But I want to emphasize something else about him, right? This is kind of like Barack Obama. His name speaks to his origin. Zoran Mamdani is the son of immigrants, right? And the idea that, right, a man who's, right, father is Muslim from Uganda, but right, ultimately of Southeast Asian extract, whose mother is Indian Hindu, is now the mayor of the largest city of the United States, right? And the juxtaposition between this image, right, of basically a peaceful or at least calm interaction between a whole bunch of Americans from a whole bunch of ethnic backgrounds, one of whom is, right, the mayor-elect of the city that suffered the worst damage on September 11th, 2001, right? Please note the strange irony of the coincidence of Mamdani being elected and Dick Cheney dying on the same day, right? A moment when Islamophobia gripped American politics, maybe that chapter really coming to a close as a Muslim American is elected to lead that very city. And the juxtaposition between this image of a city welcoming an immigrant who it might have not too long ago feared and stereotyped. And in many ways, I'll return to this in a moment, but the polling data suggests that Islamophobia, but much more importantly, dislike of Mamdani's position on Israel and Palestine did drag down his margin of victory, right? And so I want to be as clear as possible. I spoke with another group of people, mainly Jewish, in the New York City environs a couple days ago, and a bunch of Jewish people said to me, "Look, it's not about him being a Muslim. It's about his position on the issues. And by the way, we like him on a lot of issues." And this is, I think, the next thing to see, right, is that Mamdani got elected, according to the polls, even among, right, the people who might have been most attracted to him because of his identity, because of his religion or his ethnicity or his immigrant status, people who shared those identities, indicated to pollsters, exit polls, etc., that they did not vote for him because of his identity. They voted for him because of his policy position, because he remained laser focused on the two issues that matter most to most New Yorkers: affordability and inequality, right? And so the idea that this might represent an opening for the Democrats, who are obviously not going to run Muslim social democratic children of immigrants in every right district in the United States in 2026, but they might be able to run right very different candidates, centrists or even right of center Democrats, who focus on cost of living, who focus on inequality, who point out that Donald Trump, right, won in Trump's own description because of the price of groceries, but has pursued policies that have done nothing to bring inflation under control. In fact, have increased inflation at a point where it's going down almost everywhere else in the world. And that he seems to really, although he campaigns with the poor and the working class and the people who have a great deal of resentment, he gives it a target, right? The people who feel like they're left out of wealth creation, he gives them somebody to blame. But his policies actually favor the rich, increase the inequality in the United States. And that brings me then to the juxtaposition here, right? The cruelty of American politics in 2025, the targeting of immigrants by the Trump administration, but also the targeting of the people who want simply to have a peaceful, tolerant coexistence with diverse others in major cities. The Trump administration is going after them. And there's a line that was recently quoted to me by Henry Adams that politics for a long time has been the mobilization of hatred and cruelty. And this would get us to the question about how much of a correction as opposed to a deeper change in direction this election represents. The politics of cruelty and hatred are on display in many American cities right now. And the images of immigrants being pulled from their cars, their children being driven away by customs and immigration, or right, I'm sorry, border patrol agents, right? The right invasion of daycare centers by masked men in arms who represent the law enforcement of the government of the United States. That's hatred and cruelty on display. And the idea that supplemental nutrition assistance benefits, right, food benefits, are being treated as a political football, that's more of the mobilization of cruelty and hatred, the indifference to the suffering of the people who are caught in the crossfires of the debate between the parties in 2025. More example of that. And one other thing that I like about the cartoon, right, is Mamdani is smart, right? And please note that one of the things that many people have noticed about Mamdani is he seems to never tire of smiling. His smile muscles must be incredibly strong, right? Because he every time he answers a question, it ends with a big smile on his face. And in this sense, I think he represents, right, the antidote, the correction, the idea that, well, if you're angry about the inequality and the unaffordability in American society right now, that is understandable. But don't think that hateful, mean, cruel politics is any solution. In the short term, maybe if you feel like you've got somebody to blame and you can make them feel some of your pain, there's some visceral satisfaction to that. But in the long term, this does not solve your problems, and you probably end up feeling badly about the people you've made to suffer, who it turns out are not responsible for your suffering. Whereas this man, who looks like the stereotype of the people who, right, you believe or you've been led to believe made you suffer, is actually, maybe, let us see, going to try to solve your problems. Maybe it's time to tact back in that direction. So that's a little bit of what I want to talk with you about today. Before I do that, I am going to digress into one other issue, and that is because there was a big hearing in front of the Supreme Court the day after the election, and it looks almost like a 1-2 blow for Donald Trump. And so the case in front of the court concerns whether or not Trump can use the International Economic Emergency Protection Act, IEPA, to levy tariffs on the rest of the world. And by the way, not just to use, right, it, but to use it in this way that basically allows him to respond any day to anything that he doesn't like by hitting the country in question with a tariff. Canada runs an advertisement that he doesn't like, boom, the tariffs go up on Canada. And so, as is the case always in the Supreme Court, counting to five is how you determine what the likely outcome is of a case that's being argued. And it certainly looked like there were many ways to get to five in terms of defeating the IEPA tariffs. Before I go there, let's just do a quick rundown on what the tariffs are doing. And so this diagram, right, shows us the overall share of U.S. imports subject to different kinds of trade rules, tariffs especially. And as you can see, when Trump took office, there were no IEPA tariffs. There were China-specific tariffs. There were some pre-existing tariffs on about 24% of the goods entering the United States, and the average tariff rate was about 3%, 2.7%, right, for every good entering the United States. When Trump took office, and especially on Liberation Day, he ratcheted up the emergency tariffs. And so please note, right, that the majority of tariffs levied on goods entering the United States, and at this point, the majority of goods, not 24%, but 54% of the goods entering the United States are being tariffed, and more than 50% of those tariffs occur under the IEEPA Act, right? And he's added industry tariffs and continued Chinese tariffs and then pre-existing tariffs, whereas pre-existing tariffs were a large portion, they've now been reduced to a very small portion of the overall tariff rate. And if we look at this now economically, the average tariff on goods entering the United States is about 18%. If I've got that right, it shifts so often. I didn't update my figure over the last week, but I believe, right, it's gone from around 3% to around 18%. And what that means is tariff revenue, right? If you look at this diagram, which is put out by the Treasury Department by Scott Bessent, right, has gone from being around $7-8 billion a month to being around $30 billion a month in July. I'm sure it's gone up from then. So right, the overall rate that goods are tariffed has, right, quadrupled at least, and this is impacting the American economy. So this is from the Bank of International Settlements, and a technical data gathering institution. And two things to notice here, right? Which is in terms of real GDP, right? This is the diagram here, and it's giving us a variety of countries that we can compare, right? The world GDP appears to be contracting ever so slightly, but in the United States, Canada, and Mexico, right? The NAFTA trade area, those are the three worst economies in the world right now in terms of contraction. And the reason is simple, right? They were the three most integrated national economies in the world, more integrated than the European Union. And essentially, goods were flowing back and forth between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and a large portion of them flowing from Canada and Mexico to the United States without tariffs, without friction. It was an effective free trade zone. The fact that that has been ground to a halt, and that everything that transfers between Mexico and the United States, Canada and the United States, and goes back and forth multiple times, as many of these industries are structured, is now tariffed, is impacting negatively the economic prospects, the economic performance of all three countries. Then look at inflation, right? And again, comparing the United States with the rest of the world, with Canada, with Mexico, with European countries, with India, with Brazil, right? Almost every other country in the world has inflation under control. In the United States, it keeps going up, right? And so the tariffs are significant and are having a significant and negative impact on our country. This is part of the reason, right, that Donald Trump did so poorly in or I should say, right, Trump's party did so poorly in Tuesday's election. Let me add very quickly, and this will be a topic for another occasion, but right, with the Conference of the Participants, the big United Nations Conference on Climate Change getting underway in Brazil right now, with the United States not participating in that conference, with Donald Trump doing everything in his power to reverse the Biden initiatives on transitioning to renewable or sustainable energy sources. Energy-based inflation is extremely important in the United States right now. And that is another area where Donald Trump's policies seem to be directly responsible for things that the electorate clearly doesn't like. Having said all of that, the Supreme Court needs to turn a blind eye to all of this, or to do its best. It is not a policy-making institution. It's not a barometer of the economic success of the president's policies. It is meant to only determine legal and constitutional issues, and the narrow question in front of it is whether or not the statute in question empowers the president to use tariffs in the way that he has, and whether or not, if it does, is it in fact constitutional for Congress to delegate this kind of power to the president. And so now I need to unpack a little bit what it seemed to be the different justices were concerned about as they questioned the Solicitor General representing the Trump administration. There's one line that I think is particularly straightforward. It appears, be the line that the three Democratic appointed justices take, and it seems that Amy Coney Barrett is attracted to this line as well, which is to say this statute just doesn't give this president the powers that he's claiming on the basis of it. That IEPA says two things. The first is that the president, under conditions of genuine international economic emergency, has the power to regulate imports and to do so to address the emergency, right? And the issue here is really twofold. What does regulate mean? Does it include the power to tax or to levy tariffs? And there seems to be considerable textual and historical evidence that that's not what regulate means. And Amy Coney Barrett disagreed sharply with Samuel Alito, who does believe that regulate includes the tariff power, and so that IEPA gives the president or doesn't give the president the power to exercise tariff authority, claiming the authority of this statute. And then the second question is, what does emergency mean? International economic emergency. Is Canada airing an advertisement in which Ronald Reagan is quoted being opposed to tariffs and in favor of free trade? Or is the Brazilian judicial system going after their former president for having stolen or trying to steal an election? Are those international economic emergencies? If not, the president is abusing the authority, right? And so all of this is to say, right, that there's a narrow textual basis for challenging Donald Trump's legislative authority to do this. But I don't think that lets us count to five. As far as I can tell, if we want to get to five justices opposing Trump's authority to impose tariffs, two other doctrinal issues need to come in. One of which is the so-called major questions doctrine. And by the way, I think that Amy Coney Barrett may also be sympathetic to this line of reasoning. But this is a doctrine that John Roberts introduced, you could say fabricated in the last few years, introduced it in order, in part, to scale back Joe Biden's executive authority, for instance, his authority to use the economic emergency of COVID to give relief to students who had high loan debt, or for former students, and to relieve them of some of that debt. And John Roberts and the majority, the conservative majority of the court, denied Joe Biden the authority to do this on the basis of the major questions doctrine. They also have denied the capacity of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate coal-fired power plants in West Virginia in certain ways using this doctrine. And this doctrine says, well, Congress, in passing these statutes, right, the one that gives the president the power in emergencies to maybe forgive a certain amount of loans, or the EPA, the power to regulate West Virginia coal power plants, Congress can delegate a minor level of its authority, or authority on minor issues. But if the Constitution assigns the power to legislate to the Congress, And if Congress is trying to delegate that power to the president on major questions, then that runs afoul of the constitutional separation of powers. Congress has to make the law, right? And so the interesting aspect of this argument is even if Trump is right that IEPA allows him to do this, then that makes IEPA unconstitutional on the major questions doctrine. That seemed to be the line of reasoning that Roberts was using. And I think we're going to get into this in a moment. Well, if you're like me, you would like to see Donald Trump deprived of the power to exercise tariffs or to levy tariffs in this willy-nilly fashion. But you have to be worried about the doctrinal basis on which the court does it, because, of course, if they continue to develop the major questions doctrine, it's going to have implications beyond this case. Similarly, Neil Gorsuch, and this I think is really the most interesting of the lines of questioning, appeared to be very hostile to the idea that Congress could use this statute to give the president this kind of power, right? And his basis is broader still. It's about the delegation doctrine as such. Which powers can Congress transfer to, and which can it not transfer to the President of the United States? And here, right, the originalism of Gorsuch comes in as well. Article 1 of the Constitution gives Congress the power to tax and levy these kinds of import fees, right? And if the Constitution meant to locate them exclusively with Congress, then Congress should not be able to delegate them to the president. And please note, right, that this is in the context of a revolution fought on the principle no taxation without representation, a tariff is a tax, and is the president adequately representative to levy a tax? The president of the United States, right, can win with 50.1% of the vote. He only, right, gets elected every 4 years. If you're like Donald Trump, presumably you are second term, right, president. You're not ever standing for election again. And so the mechanism of representative accountability is too attenuated to let the president levy taxes, imposts, etc. It has to be Congress, because the members of the House of Representatives, they're going to stand for election next year. They stand every 2 years. The members of the Senate less frequently, but they want to win again and again. They're going to listen more to the popular will, and therefore taxation should stay with Congress. Now, this is where things get interesting, because when Gorsuch presented this line of reasoning to the Solicitor General responded, well, the Congress can continue to exercise this authority. If it doesn't like what the president is doing with the authority it delegates to him, it can take it back. And Gorsuch pointed out that's much easier to say than it is to do, because, first of all, in the 21st century, if Congress is controlled by the same party as the president, it's highly unlikely that they're actually going to restrain the president's use of an authority they've given him. But even if they decide that they want to take this power back, they have to pass new legislation, and the president can veto that legislation. And that means there has to be a veto-proof majority in favor of restraining the president's power. And Gorsuch referred to this as a kind of ratcheting transfer of power. A ratchet only turns one way. You give this power to the president, it's really, really hard, perhaps in the 21st century, at least in the current political climate, impossible to envision Congress taking this power back. So if we believe that the power was assigned to Congress for a good reason, if we believe in checks and balances and the tight coupling of taxation to the most representative institution in our federal government, then Congress and Congress alone has to exercise this power. And I happen to find myself somewhat sympathetic with Gorsuch's reasoning on this, and I would note it has implications for whether or not Congress can authorize the president to blow up boats in the Caribbean or the Pacific, whether or not Congress can authorize the president or delegate to the president the power to put troops in American cities. It's a consequential line of questioning that Gorsuch was engaged in. Having said all of that, right, I want to be clear. I'd like to see the right president's ability to levy these tariffs taken away. I think that it's worthwhile noting two things. First of all, these tariffs can probably be resurrected even if the Supreme Court rules that IEPA does not authorize or IEPA is not constitutional, using clear statutory authority that doesn't seem to run into these problems. It is a less flexible authority because it's not an emergency power. The president has to engage in a fact-finding mission and show that the appropriate conditions have been met, and then he has to actually share those findings with Congress and give them 30 days comment period before levying the tariff. So he can't wake up in the morning and have a bad breakfast and decide to tariff England because it made the bad oatmeal, right? The issue is it doesn't give him as rapid unilateral power over the tariffs as he wants, but it appears that probably 90% of the tariffs could be resurrected even if he loses this case. And then I'll just add very quickly, as I've spoken with you about before, the Supreme Court has, for much of the Trump administration, looked frankly like the judicial wing of the Make America Great Again Republican Party. It has looked like Donald Trump's lapdog. And the idea that the justices are perhaps attracted to the idea of giving Donald Trump a major loss, something he really cares about on his tariffs. Look at how independent we are, that an institutionalist like Roberts or Comey Barrett might really want to be able to say to the American people, we're not just doing Donald Trump's dirty work or legitimizing everything he wants to do. Look, we stood up to him. But if they then side with Donald Trump on birthright citizenship, for instance, well, they're not his lapdog. That gives it a certain legitimacy, but they're doing it in a case where it turns out Donald Trump can actually do everything he wants to do without winning this case, right? And then the other, and I think frankly more worrying aspect of the delegation doctrine and the major questions doctrine is that they potentially have broader implications. They could imply, for instance, when Congress set up the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, they gave the agency the charge to protect Americans' water supply and air from things that endanger our lives. But Congress did not say, we know exactly what those things are, or what part per million of this gas or this pollutant is an actual danger. They asked the EPA to hire the scientific and public health experts to make that determination and then regulate accordingly. That's a delegation of authority on something that might look like a major question. And so if this is the basis on which we count to 5 in this case, be careful, that it doesn't come back to haunt us. We're going to be saddled with a conservative majority on this court for a very long time. They are playing a long game, laying groundwork for things that they want to do in the future. All right. So having digressed there for a little while, let me get back to the election. And by the way, if you have questions about the Supreme Court, go ahead and ask them now. Just unmute yourself or put it in the chat. I'm going to keep going because there's a lot to talk about here as well. And so I have already pointed out, right? This was a real and important victory for the Democrats, right? Mamdani won, right, by nearly 10%. Proposition 50 passed nearly 2-1, right? There were polls in New Jersey last week saying that this race was almost too close to call. Mikey Carroll won by 13%. In Virginia, which had recently elected a Republican governor, Spamberger won by almost 15%, right? And so if you look at Virginia for a second, which is, I think, still a purple state, still a bellwether state, what you see is that every county in Virginia, every county, shifted to the left compared with the previous gubernatorial campaign, 2021, and didn't shift in small amounts, right? Plus 17, plus 14, plus 10, plus 8, plus 19 in Prince Williams County. These are big swings, right? And one way to look at this in terms of, right, the actual numbers of votes in metropolitan areas, huge increases. And I want you to see the pattern here, right? So I don't know if you can make this out. That's 2013, 2017, 2021, 2025. The pattern is clear, right? When Trump is not in the White House, Democrats do worse. When he's in the White House, they do better. This is the Republican vote in the smaller metro and the rural areas. And again, right, a real falling off in Republican vote when Trump is in the White House. Trump is dragging down Republican prospects, mobilizing Democrats in purple states. One more, I think really important thing to be thinking about here is Hispanic voters. And New Jersey gives us a much better, right, insight into this. And so just for a moment, backtrack a year ago, right? And one of the things we noticed is that Donald Trump seemed to have assembled a multiracial working class coalition to gain office, right? It wasn't just that the white working class turned out for him as they have since 2016, but it was also that Hispanic and Black working class people seemed to also move in Trump's direction in 2024. And given the demographics of the United States, if the Republican Party wants to be a major party in the future, it's extremely important that they have a more diverse coalition. And it's not just the case, right, that like Virginia, New Jersey, right, which went heavily in Trump's favor, not all the way, but substantially in 2024, corrected in 2025, right? It is the case that in particular, right, in counties with Hispanic majorities, in, as far as we can tell, the majority, well, the Latino vote based on exit polls, they actually really corrected course, right? Not just going back to where they were in 2020, going further in favor of the Democrats. And I just want to notice for a second a pattern here. And it's a pattern that has implications for 2026, for 2028, but just also analytically for making sense of American politics. Donald Trump looked at the 2024 results and thought, we have a new coalition, right? A working class interracial or multiracial coalition. And therefore, we have deep support for our policies. And we can begin to do the things we really want to do, the things outlined in Project 2025. And I think that it is clear now, at least as far as New Jersey and Virginia, New York and California are concerned, that this was a miss or an overinterpretation of these election results. That in many ways, the reason Donald Trump is the president of the United States is because the Democrats were in disarray. They had a candidate who had not actually made it through primary votes, but who'd been handed off the right baton of the candidacy from Joe Biden, who had proven to be incapable of running again in 2024. And it made people mistrust the Democratic Party. Why were they trying to pull the wool over our eyes about Joe Biden's health when it was so obvious to so many people? And frankly, it meant that the candidate that we had was not the candidate who had passed the test of the primaries, which might have been Kamala Harris, but she might have come out of it more mature, stronger, more adept at electoral politics, and with the confidence of at least Democratic voters behind her. Instead, right, she entered a sprint of a campaign with very little preparation, but also very little legitimacy with the electorate. But having said that, I also want to notice another dynamic here, which is this interpretation. We won the election, right? That must mean that people support our agenda in the way that we understand our agenda. And here I think it's worthwhile noting that when, right, Donald Trump was running for office, he disavowed knowledge of Project 2025, right? He focused not as laser-like as Mamdani did, but on the issue of inflation. He said right after he won the election that the reason I won is because of the price of groceries, but he has not governed in that way, right? His governing has been about cruelty, about meanness, but also about frankly paying dividends to those who invested in his campaign. And those are almost all industries that frankly have interests that are adverse to the interests of his bedrock supporter, his base, right? They are industries like the big tech industry or the big petrochemical industries that want things that make them richer, but tend to increase prices or diminish governmental services. So the idea that Elon Musk, Stephen Miller and Russell Vought are like the most important people in the first year of the second Trump administration indicates that they are not actually focused on doing what got them elected. And by the way, I don't think Donald Trump is likely to correct course. I do think that these results are likely to attract very high quality Democratic candidates to contest the 2026 election. And so I'll just point out very quickly, right, one more thing about this, right? Zoran Mamdani is a Muslim child of immigrants who is a democratic socialist who won in New York City, right? Mikey Sherrill, a moderate Democrat, Spamberger, a more conservative Democrat, but all three of them have certain things in common. They all focused on the cost of living. They all focused on the affordability crisis. They all focused on inequality. They all focused on making government function for the people. And it appears that that may be the beginning of a winning formula for the Democrats in 2026. One more thing to notice, right? None of these people was in office in 2016. These are all Democrats who've come of age within the party during the Donald Trump era and seem to have figured out better than perhaps the older generation of Democrats how to win in the Trump era. And by the way, one more thing about Trump, right? This election occurs essentially at the low point of his second term popularity so far, right? As you can see, his disapproval rating has really shot up in the period in which the more graphic evidence of how mean and cruel the immigration enforcement policy is has really circulated widely. During the period of the government shutdown, during the period in which he took a wrecking ball to the East Wing of the White House as if it was just another of his development projects, right? So his approval rating, again, way down. His approval rating on immigration down, on the economy and trade, way down, on the inflation issue, in the absolute basement. Strong disapproval of him very high, strong approval very low. But there's one more election result that I want to now focus on for the remainder of today. And that's the California result. And on the one hand, right, this is a win for Gavin Newsom, and it maybe elevates his right electoral prospects for 2028. The fact that he actually fought fire with fire, countered the Texas redistricting plan with California's own redistricting plan, preventing the Republicans from muting the ability of the electorate to punish them for doing things they don't like, right? But I want to notice that it is also the beginning of a new, and it appears quite different, but perhaps quite substantial trend in American politics, which is mid-decade redistricting, or redistricting not when the census results give us new information, force us to adjust our districts in order to preserve the principle of one person, one vote, or roughly proportionate representation. If a bunch of people moved out of California and to Texas, Texas needs to get more representatives, California fewer, right? That is a democratically justifiable rationale for redistricting, and it is constitutionally required. But what we're seeing in 2025 is not that. It's simply there is a partisan advantage to be had by putting lines in a different place in the map. And so for purely partisan advantage, let's do this. And I want to focus then on the danger to our electoral system, on the fact that this is symptomatic both of a new approach to politics, which is a kind of winner take all and no holds barred. We will change the rules in the middle of the game in ways that the rules don't appear to allow but don't appear to prohibit, and do it for no other reason than partisan advantage. The slogan that you hear is, this is allowing the politicians to choose their electorate and not allowing the electorate to choose their politicians. So Trump's response, it appears, to the resounding right pushback against the way he's governing, and we know this from the meeting with the Republican leaders yesterday, has not been to say, okay, I better correct course. That's not the kind of politician he is. Please note, on election day, after having been ordered by a judge to release SNAP benefits, Trump took to social media and said, I'm not going to follow the judge's order. He made it obvious that he's using needed nutritional assistance for the poor as a political football on election day. He's not the kind of politician who, right, takes his licks and changes course. So what's he going to do instead? He's going to try to redistrict, gerrymander to the maximum extent possible to prevent his unpopularity translating into a capacity for the electorate to change course. The reason this is possible is because of the way the United States organizes our congressional elections, our elections for the House of Representatives. We use something called single member territorially based districts. And You might recognize that term, you might not, but what it means is basically where you live determines who you get to vote for. You only get to vote for one candidate for Congress, and whoever gets the majority or the most votes in your district represents you, whether you voted for them or not. And you might say to yourself, well, how else are we supposed to conduct congressional districts? I'm sorry, congressional elections. And here I would just notice very quickly that when you talk to people who study elections from the rest of the world, they note that looking at the United States is like going to an electoral systems museum. This is the way the world did it in the 19th century. But guess what? In the 20th century, we figured out other ways to do it that are better for democracy. And here it is, the 21st century. Most of the democratic world doesn't use this system anymore, but here the United States is acting as if it's the only system around. And in this system and this system alone, drawing lines on maps basically determines constituencies, outcomes, and the nature of representation. This is illustrated by this diagram, right? This is an electorate that's divided 60% to 40% blue to red. And so in this way of drawing the map, right, the fact that the electorate is 60% blue and 40% red leads to representatives who are 60% blue and 40% red, so-called perfectly proportional representation. But please note, for the most part, we aren't boxes on a grid. We live in complexly, right, organized geographic areas, and the result is that it's very hard to devise territorially based districts to get at perfectly proportionate representation. And by the way, the parties have no incentive, no interest to do that. So imagine that instead of these districts, the blues, right, call them the Democrats, are completely in control and they decide to maximize their advantage, their partisan electoral advantage by redistricting, right? And so they draw their lines like this. And please note that the outcome is 5 blue representatives, right? 100%, right? Representation for the party that gets 60% of the vote, 0% representation for the party that gets 40% of the vote. Or alternatively, if red is in power, it's a little bit more complicated. They're not really compact districts, but you can kind of carve up these grids so that you come out with red only getting 40% of the vote, but 60% of the representation. And just so you can see, right, that these diagrams make it relatively easy to see, when we look at elections in practice in the United States, what we see is this is exactly what parties are doing. This is a little bit of an old diagram. I'm just using it to represent what we know to be the case, right? So in blue states where Democrats are in control, they get on average about 60% of the vote. They get about 70% of the representatives to the House, right? And that then is obviously disproportionate. They have carved the electoral field to favor them. Republicans get about 40% of the vote, but only about 30% of the representatives. When we now turn to red states, we see that Democrats get about 40% of the vote and only about a quarter of the representatives. Republicans get about 60% of the vote and 75% of the representatives. And what we see from this is a few things, right? Gerrymandering is real. It really does affect the way in which we're representative to make it unproportionate. It is not the case that, right, the division within the electorate determines the division within Congress. But in addition to that, we also see that this is occurring in both blue and red states, but that Republicans have up until now done this more aggressively than Democrats, right? The advantage that they carve out for themselves is more of an advantage. And we know, right, that in California and New York and elsewhere, the Democrats have actually passed laws when in power to prevent them from gerrymandering in a partisan or maximalist way. But what the right Proposition 50 victory seems to represent is that the Democrats have decided they have to fight fire with fire. They're going to go down this path as long as the Republican Party is going down this path, and it worries me. I'll say very quickly just how extreme this can get, right? This is Pennsylvania in 2012, the second, right, Barack Obama victory. Barack Obama won Pennsylvania, and in the House vote, the Democrats won the overall popular vote in the state. They won it, right, 50% to 49% by about 80,000 votes out of a little bit over 5 million voters, right? But Republicans won 72% of the representatives in Congress, 13 to 5 House advantage, despite having fewer votes for their candidates in the state. And I'll say this very quickly. This right map was eventually invalidated in the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court would not invalidate that map today, right? And that's in part because of a decision from 2019 called Rucho v. Common Cause, which is a decision in which the Supreme Court said, we're not going to look at partisan gerrymandering anymore. We don't believe the Constitution gives us the power or that we have the wherewithal to sort this stuff out. And so it is no holds barred, free for all on gerrymandering as far as the Supreme Court is concerned if it's done on a partisan basis. Second, I think really consequential Supreme Court issue here. Already, when Pennsylvania was doing this, the Supreme Court had decided, I believe, in the Holder decision to invalidate Article 5 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. It is now the case that the Supreme Court, in a decision I've spoken with you about a little bit, a case I've spoken with you about a little bit, Louisiana versus Caillet, is considering invalidating Article 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And so one of the things that has restricted maximum partisan redistricting, is the overlap of race and partisan identity in the United States. And the way in which the Supreme Court and other courts have interpreted the Voting Rights Act has allowed them to say, we don't actually need evidence that you're racist. We just need evidence that your districts have effects on the racial minority in your state that prevent them from exercising roughly proportionate power. And if the Supreme Court undoes that, well, then every one of these states, right? These are all the states in which one party is in control of the governorship, the legislature, and the Supreme Court. Each one of these states will be able to do maximal partisan redistricting. And to see what that looks like, right? This is an illustration of what California could be, of what Texas could be, if the parties that are in unilateral control of those states were not restricted by the Voting Rights Act, were not restricted by the Supreme Court, and decided to do maximal partisan redistricting. I have on the board here a little bit of language, Madisonian majorities versus permanent minorities. James Madison in the Federalist Papers suggested that the House of Representatives would be an accountable and responsive institution because those who were elected would recognize that if they did not govern with responsiveness and pass laws that served the interests or needs of their constituents would throw their weight into a different candidate in the next election. A Madisonian majority is a temporary and potentially shifting majority. When politicians choose their constituents as opposed to the other way around, they're trying to prevent that Madisonian correction from kicking in, trying to prevent there being enough dissatisfied voters in the district to vote, in this case, the Republican out of office. That's what Texas clearly was doing. If they went full force on this idea, we could end up with fewer and fewer competitive elections in the United States, more and more predetermination of what the outcome in the election is going to be by the parties doing the districting. If, by the way, Louisiana v. Kaye, it goes the way it certainly appears, it seems like it's very easy to count to 5 or 6 in that case, based on the oral argument which occurred in October. Then, by the way, a dozen Democratic seats, a dozen seats that are also represented by African Americans, almost half the African American congressional coalition is created by the Voting Rights Act Article 2 enforcement. There's going to be still more opportunity for gerrymandering, still less opportunity to use elections to produce accountability in the United States. And I think this is a really, really worrying trend. We know that almost 2/3 of the United States thinks that our political system is too divided to solve our country's problems. And that when we look at what the ranking of problems is in the United States, please note, right, that the number one problem, September 2025, is still the economy. But the number two problem is now polarization. Number three problem is the Republican Party. The number four problem, the state of democracy. The number six problem, the Democratic Party, right? If you add all of this together, all of these, right, ways of measuring the problems with our political system, the number one problem in our politics, according to American citizens, is the political system itself. And by the way, this reflects the fact that most people don't think the political system gives them power, allows them to force their politicians to respond to their most urgent needs. And they're right. You know, this is something we've looked at again and again and again. But statistically speaking, it is the case that our representatives are essentially indifferent to the interest of the bottom 90% of American people whenever those interests conflict with either economic elite preferences or interest group preferences. We add to that, right, the idea that there's so many places in the political system where you can block legislation being passed. And I think we see, if you will, another explanation for these relatively rapid thermostatic corrections in American politics. You put your hopes into Barack Obama, and 8 years later, you feel like, well, he got some stuff done. He passed the Affordable Care Act, but mainly my life got worse, not better. And so I'm going to try the other brand, right? And I vote for Donald Trump. And, well, you know, things didn't get any better, so I'll vote for Joe Biden. Things didn't get any better, I'll vote for Donald Trump, as opposed to, right, there being some major correction going on. This is, right, a kind of whoever is in power is incapable of getting enough done to be satisfied, and therefore we very quickly pivot back to the other candidate. I think it's worthwhile noticing, and it's fascinating, that in New York City, there are a fair number of what you would call Trump Mamdani voters, people who voted for both Donald Trump and Zoran Mamdani. That's a really strange person, unless you think this is a person desperate for democratic accountability and desperately searching for anybody who seems to promise it. And by the way, when Donald Trump is in office, somebody unlike him seems the best likely uh, candidate to be able to deliver that. When, right, Biden is in office, someone like Donald Trump seems like the best candidate to be able to deliver accountability. The systemic problem here, right, the problem with non-representation in American politics cannot be fixed by elections and may in fact be worsened by elections if the elections lead to a constant race to redistrict, to change the rules of the game, to make, frankly, our elections less accountable. All right, so let me stop there. I imagine you have plenty to talk about, whether it's Supreme Court and tariffs or what happened in the elections on Tuesday. Who wants to start us out? Go ahead, Sandy.
I think the fact that gun control measures didn't pass and we're not passing things to help global warming are examples of them, of Congress not being representative.
Yeah, and a deeper issue related to this, right? Um, the industry from which Trump apparently got the largest donations is the, right, petrochemical industry, right? It may be as much as $1 billion. So we weren't sure, Elon Musk was the number one contributor. Maybe it was big tech, but it looks like it's big oil. And the Trump administration is clearly governing on the side of big oil in ways that are not just, right, failing to address climate change. And in light of, right, the damage we're seeing from the hurricanes, from the fires, from the floods, I think people are increasingly clear about the fact this is not a Chinese hoax or a left-wing conspiracy. This is real, and it's really beginning to impact us, and we want a government that can do something about it. But even more important, the war on renewables, right? And I spoke with you about this a year ago. For the first time, renewable energy became the most affordable energy source in the world, right? And the idea that we are systematically, legally prohibiting our states from using the most affordable electrical generating system, right? At the same time that demand for electricity is going up with more electrical vehicles, with more people using the kinds of electronic technology we're using right now, but especially with this huge AI boom leading to these construction of data centers everywhere they can find the land to do it. And they are energy intensive. Their need for electricity is almost bottomless. The idea that we're cutting ourselves off from the cheapest source of electricity is an independent issue because it means, and this is stunning, right, that utility bills have gone up almost 10% across the nation this year, right? And that's one of the big drivers of inflation in the United States. And by the way, again, in most other countries in the world, energy prices are going down in part because they're making the transition to renewables. So, yes, there is a global warming aspect or face to this issue, but there's also just a basic pragmatic issue here. Shouldn't we be availing ourselves of cheaper energy if it's out there? On guns, again, yes, absolutely. It's a little bit more complicated in the sense that unfortunately we have a Second Amendment to the Constitution and the Supreme Court hell bent on interpreting it as giving us near limitless rights to have lethal weapons. And the result is that even if our legislatures vote for sound common sense gun control legislation, it's likely to be invalidated by the Supreme Court. Yeah, thank you, Sandy, and in good illustrations. Anybody else thought, question, idea for today?
David, uh,
Jonathan, go ahead.
yeah, on the matter of cruelty, one hears the word used more and more, quite rightly, and quite all the more recently. Um, when Princess Diana died, a commentator noted that there were shrines put up on with such frequency on so many roads and passageways in the UK uh, that it led one to believe, the commentator said, that uh, Renaissance Catholicism was not that far at all below the surface. I'm wondering more and more whether the Puritan founding of the United States where which would say, I'm paraphrasing, I think, if God had uh, intended the islanders in the Caribbean and those in the Philippines to have stable and uh, 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 more strongly built housing, he would have given those people that housing. If God had intended certain classes of people to be rich, he would have made them rich. Kai Erikson, the sociologist, mentions this at the beginning of his book on the Salem witch trials. Erikson said that the uh, Calvinist tradition established what was, in his view, in Erickson's view, the cruelest of all Christian sects.
Yeah, thank you for that wide-ranging comment, Jonathan. And I'm going to suggest, right? I quoted that Henry Adams, or the referred to that Henry Adams quote. You know that politics is often the business of mobilizing cruelty and hatred. That you don't need a Protestant explanation for that, right? You know, it happens in Catholic countries, it happens in Muslim countries, it happens in Hindu countries, and so we are having a debate about whether or not the hitherto religious majority of the United States is maintaining that Protestant majority is necessary to maintain the culture that makes our institutions function. I started with that cartoon of Mamdani to suggest that the better microcosm of the United States today is not of a religiously homogenous, but of a religiously diverse society in which, right, a substantial portion of the population is probably agnostic or atheistic, or has some sort of syncretic religious belief. But yes, that meanness lurks beneath the surface of our politics, I think is quite clear, and that we very often it's a liability of democracy, right? To want to find the scapegoat on which we can blame our problems, especially as our problems get hard to solve. If we really are not at all confident that we can solve our problems, well, it sure as hell is easy enough to try to make the people we blame suffer. Right? That's something we know how to do. And so the idea that it gives almost a false sense of empowerment. And then you gotta hope, right, that on the one hand, we learn from the failure of this politics. Well, yeah, it maybe felt good for 5 minutes to think that those people were to blame and that we could punish them. But turns out that punishing them doesn't accomplish anything other than making us feel bad about what we then have to witness, right? And that at that point we hope also that our conscience kicks in and that we begin to notice the meanness doesn't generate the results, but it does diminish us as a people, as a society. It brings out the worst aspects of ourselves, and we don't want our politicians to do that. We want them to represent the better angels of our nature, not the worst demons that lurk in the dark places in our psyches. And so, Jonathan, I take the point, and I'm running in a slightly different direction with it, but it's nice to hear from you and to hear the reference to Kai Erikson, who's an old favorite of mine in the sociological literature as well. So I see, David, you've got your hand up. Maybe we can make this the last comment for today because I'm looking at the time. We're way over. Go ahead.
Yeah, and you may have talked about this. I lost my internet connection for about 25 minutes.
Oh no.
And the question that puzzled me, or the issue that puzzled me yesterday, was Ketanji Brown Jackson's ruling that Trump could keep his SNAP policy in operation while while she suggested that the appeals court needed to hear more arguments from the administration. And I don't understand, didn't they hear arguments already in that case? And when the judge rejected the Trump proposal, I just don't understand why she ruled what she did. Maybe you talked about this already. If so, I apologize.
No, thank you for calling our attention to it. And I did not talk about it. The Supreme Court right case I focused on is the case with regards to tariffs. And I'll just say this very briefly, right? Actually, two separate right federal judges have held that the Trump administration needs to distribute the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program benefits to the states immediately and in full. Right? It's an important finding. And please note that the Trump administration has appealed it, right? And what one of the lower court judges held was, well, they still have to distribute the benefits while it's being appealed. And so it hasn't gone in front of an appellate court yet. It will go in front of the Ninth Circuit. And that Ketanji Brown Jackson temporary restraining order was to prevent the decision from going into effect while it was being appealed. But please note, multiple things are happening here, right? Brown Jackson's short signed order, it could have been anybody else. I think probably in a sense she got out in front of her colleagues because it was one thing she thought she could do in a slightly conciliatory way with the conservative justices. But it's a short-term order, and it does direct the Ninth to hear this as quickly as possible. I don't know what their time frame is, but also notice that the Department of Agriculture, which handles these benefits, wrote letters to the states on Friday telling them to begin distributing the full benefits. And I know that New Jersey already is in the process of doing this. I know New York is not, that there's going to be some state by state inertia or differences. One of the questions here is, why is the Department of Agriculture telling them to distribute the benefits while the Trump administration is appealing the decision, right? And I imagine there are at least some states, this is an almost $9 billion program, a very expensive program, that don't want to be on the hook for having distributed benefits that the federal government is not going to reimburse them for. It could wreck their budgets, right? So that's my sense of what's at play. And please note, when we talk about the cruelty and meanness in American politics, the idea that the government has been shut down for coming up on 40 days now, that air traffic control is grinding right to quite slow and inconvenient state of affairs, and that 1 in 8 Americans is experiencing food insecurity. All of this speaks to the cruelty and the obviousness with which Donald Trump is saying, I'd rather not feed people who need this assistance in order to ratchet up the pressure on the Democrats, right? And so again, he's not correcting course. He's not listening to the people's feedback. He wants to continue to do what he thinks this election licensed him to do. But I think the American people are saying quite clearly that was not our intent. This is not representative of us. At least a substantial majority of us are saying, no, not in our name. Thank you for the question, David. I want to say one more thing, and I got an email that, if you remember last week when we spoke about this at length, I suggested one thing you could do would be to make a food bank donation. And I got an email forwarded to me that you guys had actually taken up that idea, and some of you were doing that. And I just want to say it's gratifying to hear that, and I'm glad you're doing what you can. If our politics gets cruel, we can, right, in our day-to-day life, try to counter it by being humane in little ways. We can't do what the federal government can do, but we can at least try to say to the people in its crosshairs, we want to do what we can to reassert our compassion. And I think that's what you guys are doing with this regard. Thank you for doing it. Be well, everybody. Good being with you as always. I will see everybody next week. Take care, guys. Bye bye.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
David.
Pleasure as always. Thank you, guys. Bye bye.